It was the kind of morning that carried no promise of adventure, only the ordinary rhythm of a small town waking up to its chores. The sun had just risen over the line of low hills, painting the dew-drenched fields with a fragile shimmer. Anna Blake adjusted the scarf on her head, tucking a stubborn strand of hair away as she carried the heavy bundle of paper targets under her arm. She wasn't a soldier, wasn't a marksman, and she certainly wasn't someone anyone would expect to find on a training range. But there she was, her boots crunching against gravel as she crossed the dirt road leading toward the shooting range where the local guard sometimes practiced. For years she had been the one quietly maintaining the grounds, not officially, not because anyone asked her to, but because she hated seeing disorder. Her late husband, Samuel, had once been a part of the National Guard before a heart condition pulled him out of service. He used to come down here every Saturday to practice, polishing his rifle with a kind of reverence Anna never fully understood until after he passed away 3 years ago. The range fell into disrepair. Targets left tattered in the wind, wooden posts splintered and leaning, bullet casings scattered like forgotten echoes of discipline and duty. No one else seemed to care. But Anna did. Replacing those targets had become her ritual. Every week, she carried new sheets out, carefully stapling them into place with the patience of someone sewing fabric, the sound of the staple gun echoing faintly through the quiet valley. It was her way of keeping Samuel's spirit alive, of maintaining the little corner of order he had once cared about so deeply. Some people in town thought she was eccentric, some thought she was lonely. Maybe she was both. But out here, standing with the paper squares in her hands, she felt a strange dignity. She wasn't strong, she wasn't young, but she could still do this. That morning, as she bent down to gather up the shredded remains of yesterday's targets, she felt the ground tremble faintly under heavy boots. At first, she thought it was just one of the guard boys come early. But when she looked up, she saw a man unlike any she had ever seen. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet power in the way he moved. He wore no uniform that she recognized, just worn tactical gear, dust clinging to his boots, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. His eyes were sharp, carrying something harder than steel and yet tempered by exhaustion. "Ma'am," he said in a voice low but steady, the kind of voice that carried authority even when spoken softly. "You shouldn't be here alone." Anna blinked at him, clutching the bundle of targets tighter to her chest. "I come here every morning," she answered simply, her voice gentle but firm. No harm in it. The man studied her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He wasn't used to seeing civilians out here, certainly not an older woman with hands but still steady as she pulled a staple gun from her bag. She didn't ask who he was or why he was here. She simply turned back to the posts and began her work, pressing a fresh paper square against the wood and fastening it with a satisfying snap of metal. He stepped closer, the crunch of gravel loud in the silence. "Why?" he asked suddenly. Anna paused, glancing at him. There was no hostility in his question, only a genuine curiosity, as though the idea of someone doing something so simple, so selfless, was foreign to him. She smiled faintly, a soft curve of lips that carried both sorrow and warmth. "Because someone has to," she said. "These things, discipline, practice, respect, they matter. My husband believed that. I suppose I believe it too." The SEAL, because that's what he was though she didn't know it yet, shifted his rifle from his shoulder, gripping it with one hand. His expression softened for just a moment, and Anna caught something flicker in his eyes. Respect. Not the kind a soldier gave to rank, but the kind a man gave to someone who understood something deeper. He watched her work for several minutes, the silence broken only by the rhythmic snap of staples and the soft flutter of paper in the breeze. Finally, when she moved to the last target stand, her hands trembled slightly from the weight of the bundle. Without a word, he stepped forward, taking the sheets from her arms with ease. His hands were scarred, his knuckles worn from battles she could only imagine, but the way he handled the thin paper was careful, almost reverent. "Thank you," Anna murmured, surprised. He nodded once, then fixed the last target himself, pressing it flat against the wood with military precision. When he stepped back, he let out a breath, as though this small act had grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. Anna tilted her head, studying him with the quiet intuition of someone who lived long enough to read people without needing words. "You've seen things," she said softly. His jaw tightened and he didn't answer at first. Instead, he unslung his rifle, checking the chamber with practiced motions, the metallic click ringing out sharp in the morning air. Anna flinched slightly at the sound, but he noticed and lowered the weapon, angling it away. His voice was almost distant when he finally replied. "Too much." Something in his tone told her not to press. So she didn't. Instead, she turned toward the range, watching the sunlight stretch across the sand, painting the targets in pale gold. Her husband used to say the range was a place of truth, because here, no matter who you were, your aim revealed what was inside you. The SEAL raised his rifle, the barrel steady as stone. He didn't take his shot immediately. Instead, he stood there, breathing as though listening to something only he could hear. Then the crack of gunfire split the silence. The target. So did the second. And the third. Each shot was precise, unflinching, almost too perfect. Anna didn't clap or cheer. She simply nodded, her lips pursed in quiet approval. "My Samuel would have liked you," she said softly. The man lowered his weapon, his eyes flicking toward her, surprised. For a moment he almost smiled. Almost. Then he turned back to the targets, scanning them with the detached focus of someone who always looked for flaws, even in perfection. It was then that something unexpected happened. He held out the rifle, not carelessly but deliberately, as if offering something sacred. "Here," he said. "Hold it." Anna froze, staring at the weapon as though it were a coiled serpent. She had never held a gun in her life. Samuel had tried once to teach her, but she always refused, preferring the safety of distance. Now this stranger, this warrior, was placing his trust in her hands. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I wouldn't know what to do." "You don't have to," he said gently. "Just feel it. Sometimes it's enough to understand the weight of what we carry." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Anna reached out. Her fingers brushed the cold steel, and he guided the rifle into her grasp. It was heavier than she expected, grounding her, pulling her into a reality she had always chosen to keep at arm's length. The SEAL stepped back, watching her carefully, not as a soldier teaching a recruit, but as a man sharing a burden. Anna looked down at the rifle, her hands trembling, not from fear but from the sheer gravity of the moment. She wasn't a guider, wasn't trained, yet in that instant, holding the weapon, she felt an unspoken connection to the thousands of untold stories carried by men like him. She lifted her gaze. For the first time that morning she understood. This wasn't just about paper targets or ritual or even memory. This was about trust. He had trusted her with something more than a weapon. He had trusted her with a piece of himself. And that was the beginning of everything. The rifle felt heavier the longer Anna held it, as though the steel carried not only weight but history, memories pressed into its surface with every scratch and mark along its barrel. Her arms strained and used to the burden, but she didn't lower it. She couldn't. Because she understood instinctively that this wasn't just an object. It was a story. It was blood, duty, loss, and survival all molded into cold metal. And this man, this soldier who had stepped into her quiet life like a shadow from another world, had given it to her not lightly, but as a kind of unspoken confession. The SEAL watched her carefully, his eyes sharp but softened with something she couldn't name. He had seen comrades collapse in the dust, had carried the weight of missions no one would ever know, and yet here he was, offering a fragment of that invisible load to a woman who lived her life between grocery lists and quiet evenings in a farmhouse that smelled of old wood and lavender soap. Anna's breath trembled, her fingers clumsy against the weapon's grip, but she didn't let go. "I never wanted to hold one of these," she murmured, her voice thin but steady. "Samuel always tried to show me. I told him no. I thought if I never touched one, maybe the world of violence could never touch me." She paused, her eyes on the distant horizon. "But it did anyway. Took him away just like it takes so many." The man said nothing, but she felt the silence thrum between them, thick with understanding. She risked a glance at him, and in his gaze she saw a reflection of her own grief, only shaped differently, harder, sharper, weathered by endless storms. He didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss her words. He simply stood, his presence a kind of shield that made her feel, for the first time in years, not alone in the weight of loss. Her arms finally shook too much to hold the rifle steady, and he stepped forward, gently taking it back with hands both calloused and careful. The relief was immediate, though a strange emptiness rushed in its place. He slung the weapon across his chest once more, and for a moment, they simply looked at one another. An old woman who had nothing left but memories and a soldier who carried too many to count. "What's your name?" she asked finally. He hesitated, then answered, "Cole." The syllable was short, clipped, like the man himself. Anna nodded slowly, committing it to memory. Cole. A name that felt both ordinary and extraordinary, because it belonged to someone who carried himself like a ghost of battlefields no one else could see. "Well, Cole," she said softly, brushing dust from her palms, "I suppose I should thank you for letting me understand. Even just for a moment. He gave a small nod, but his eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, as though he couldn't quite reconcile her simplicity with the strength she carried in her quiet rituals. They fell into a silence, broken only by the faint rustle of wind across the field. Cole adjusted his stance, restless in the way soldiers were when they weren't moving toward a mission. Anna, ever practical, returned to gathering the shredded remains of old targets, stuffing them into a burlap sack she carried for trash. She expected him to leave, to fade back into whatever shadowy path had brought him here. But he didn't. He followed her instead, his boots crunching softly behind hers. "Why do you really do this?" he asked again, his tone less curious now, more insistent, as though her first answer hadn't been enough. Anna stopped, straightening slowly. She looked at him, measuring her words carefully. "These papers," she lifted one of the shredded targets, the center torn through by bullets, "they're just symbols. But someone has to replace them. Someone has to remind the world that even when everything falls apart, there is order to be found." Cole studied her in silence, his jaw working slightly as though her words had struck something deeper than he wanted to admit. Finally he said, "You sound like someone who's served." She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Me? No. I've never even left this county. My husband wore the uniform. I just washed it." But the truth was Anna had served in her own way, though not on battlefields or in missions. She had served through devotion, through endurance, through the quiet strength of holding a family together when war took pieces of it away. Cole seemed to sense that, though he didn't push the thought aloud. Instead he shifted, his voice low. "You remind me." Anna blinked off guard. There was a rawness in his tone, a crack that betrayed the iron exterior. He hadn't meant to say it, or perhaps he had, but either way the words hung heavy between them. Oh. For a man like Cole, that word was both treasure and torment. "Then I hope it's a good reminder," she said softly. He gave the faintest nod, then looked away, his gaze scanning the horizon as though expecting danger at any moment. It struck Anna then, he wasn't here by accident. Men like him didn't simply wander into quiet towns. He was running from something or toward something. Either way he was carrying more than just the weight of his rifle. She didn't ask. She knew better. But she did something else. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos, unscrewing the cap with practiced hands. The scent of strong coffee wafted into the cool morning air. She poured some into the lid and handed it to him without ceremony. "Drink," he said. Cole hesitated only a moment before accepting. He lifted the makeshift cup to his lips, the steam curling against his face. When he swallowed, his eyes closed briefly, as though the warmth reminded him of something distant, something softer than the world he usually lived in. Anna sipped from the thermos herself, and they stood there side by side, two strangers sharing coffee in the middle of a shooting range as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The wind whispered around them, carrying with it the faint scent of gunpowder from the shredded targets. When Cole finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, more reflective. "You do more than replace paper, Anna. You keep something alive here. Something I thought was gone." She looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he crouched down, running a finger across the dusty ground where boot prints overlapped with hers. "Discipline. Honor. Ritual. They're not just for soldiers. They're for anyone who refuses to let the world fall into chaos." He straightened, meeting her gaze. "I'd forgotten that until now." Anna felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest, a fragile flame she hadn't felt since Samuel's passing. To have someone, especially a man like Cole, recognize her small act of devotion as something meaningful, it was a gift she hadn't expected. For a long while, they simply stood together, finishing the coffee, watching the sun climb higher. The targets fluttered gently in the breeze, fresh and clean, waiting for the next test of aim. Finally, Cole slung his rifle more securely and said, "I'll be here tomorrow. Early." Anna arched a brow. "To shoot?" He shook his head once. "To help." Something inside her stirred at his words. For years she had done this alone, silently, dutifully. The thought of sharing it, of not being the only caretaker of Samuel's memory and the discipline he cherished, felt strange but not unwelcome. She nodded slowly. "All right then. Tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Anna called after him. "Cole." He paused, half in shadow. "You're welcome here," she said. For the first time, his lips curved just barely into something that might have been a smile. Then he walked away, leaving only the crunch of his boots fading into the morning. Anna stood there long after he disappeared, her hands wrapped around the warm thermos, her heart unexpectedly light. She didn't know why fate had sent a soldier to her quiet corner of the world, but she knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. And for the first time in years, that thought didn't frighten her. It filled her with a quiet, steady hope. The next morning broke colder than usual, a sharp breeze threading through the valley, rattling the leaves of the old cottonwood trees. Anna tugged her scarf tighter around her neck as she made her way down the path, a bundle of fresh targets balanced under her arm. The ground was damp from a light drizzle the night before, and each step left faint impressions in the softened earth. She had almost convinced herself that yesterday had been some strange dream, that the hardened soldier named Cole was a figment her lonely mind had conjured in the quiet hours of dawn. But when she reached the range, she saw him. He was already there, standing near the target posts, his broad frame unmistakable even at a distance. The rifle rested slung across his chest as always, but his hands were empty, folded behind his back as he surveyed the torn remnants of yesterday's work. He stood so still he could have been a statue carved from stone, the rising sun casting long shadows across the ground. When he heard her boots crunching on gravel, he turned slightly, and that faint nod, the same one as yesterday, greeted her. "You came," Anna said, a mixture of surprise. Cole replied simply. His tone carried no fanfare, no need for thanks, as though keeping his word was as natural to him as breathing. Anna approached, setting the bundle of targets down on the weathered bench. "Well then," she said, brushing her hands together, "let's get to it." Cole stepped forward immediately, picking up half the stack without waiting to be asked. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had done this sort of work 1,000 times, aligning the sheets, stapling them with precision, ensuring each one was perfectly centered. Anna watched him for a moment, amused by the seriousness he applied to a task most would consider mundane. "You do realize these are just bits of paper?" she teased lightly. Cole glanced at her, one brow lifting. "Discipline is in the details." The words were delivered so matter-of-factly that Anna couldn't help but smile. Samuel had once said something similar when fixing a crooked picture in their home. If you ignore the little things, the big things fall apart faster. As they worked side by side, a rhythm developed between them. She handed him sheets, he stapled. He held posts steady, she gathered scraps. It was simple, almost domestic in its flow, yet underscored by the awareness that this man had spent years in places where nothing was simple. After a time, Anna wiped her hands on her apron and glanced toward the fresh targets fluttering in the breeze. "Well, there you go," she said. "Clean slates. Ready for whatever comes." Cole studied the line of white squares, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You ever think about that?" he asked quietly. "About what?" "Clean slates. How easy they look from a distance." He lifted his rifle, resting it against his shoulder. "But once you start shooting, you realize, you can't ever take the holes back." Anna regarded him thoughtfully, sensing the weight behind the metaphor. "I suppose that's true of life too," she said softly. "We all make our marks for better or worse. Some things you can't undo." Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then Cole broke the silence with a short, sharp exhale, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You're wiser than most of the men I've served under." Anna chuckled, shaking her head. "I'm just old. Age makes philosophers of us all." He looked at her, then really looked, as if studying every line on her face, every shadow in her eyes. But before she could ask what he was thinking, a sudden sound shattered the stillness, the distant growl of an engine. Anna frowned, turning toward the dirt road that wound into the range. A black SUV rolled slowly into view, its windows tinted, the tires crunching deliberately across the gravel. Something about the way it moved, unhurried, purposeful, sent a chill up her spine. Vehicles usually voice. And this was no government-issue truck. Cole stiffened immediately, his entire body snapping into alertness. His hand went instinctively to his rifle, unslinging it with smooth precision. His eyes narrowed as he tracked the vehicle's approach, his muscles coiled like a predator waiting to strike. Anna's heart quickened. "Friends of yours?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. His jaw tightened. "No." The SUV rolled to a stop not far from the bench, dust curling around its tires. The engine cut, and silence descended again, heavy and unnatural. Two men stepped out, both dressed in civilian clothes that did nothing to disguise the hardness in their postures. Their eyes scanned the range, then fixed on Cole with a sharpness that made Anna's breath catch. Cole shifted his stance, rifle low but ready. "Stay behind me," he murmured to Anna, his voice low but firm. Something about his tone left no room for argument. Anna obeyed, moving back a step, her fingers clutching the edge of the bench. The first man, tall with a scar cutting across his jaw, raised his hands in a mockery of peace. "Relax, Cole," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "We're not here to cause trouble. Just want to talk." Cole's reply was ice cold. "Then talk from there." The second man smirked, glancing at Anna briefly before returning his gaze to Cole. "Who's the lady? New partner?" Anna felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Cole didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the two strangers, his finger hovering near the trigger. "You shouldn't be here," Cole said flatly. The scarred man's smile faded. "And you shouldn't have walked away." The words carried weight, heavy and dangerous. Anna didn't understand them, but she felt the impact ripple through Cole. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched, and for the first time she saw the faint crack in his composure. "Leave," Cole ordered, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. The two men exchanged glances, then shrugged in unison, as if they had already accomplished what they came for. The scarred man tilted his head slightly, his smile returning, though colder this time. "We'll be seeing you, Cole." They climbed back into the SUV, the engine roaring to life once more. As the vehicle rolled away, dust clouding the air, Anna turned to Cole, her heart pounding. "What was that?" she whispered. For a long moment he said nothing. He just stood there, his rifle still clutched tightly, his eyes locked on the trail of dust fading into the horizon. Finally he exhaled, slow and heavy, and slung the weapon back across his chest. "Trouble?" he said simply. Anna waited, expecting more, but he offered no explanation. Instead he bent down, gathering the leftover scraps of paper they hadn't finished cleaning. His movements were brisk, almost mechanical, as though he could scrub away the encounter by keeping his hands busy. But Anna saw through it. She saw the tightness in his shoulders, the storm gathering in his expression. Whoever those men were, they hadn't just been strangers. They were pieces of the world Cole carried with him, the one that had followed him here. And for the first time, Anna realized that her quiet ritual, her paper targets, her mornings of solitude, had been pierced by something far larger, far darker. Cole wasn't just a soldier passing through. He was a man being hunted. And now, by some strange twist of fate, so was she. Anna didn't follow Cole immediately. She stood frozen for several breaths, the echo of that SUV's engine still rumbling in her ears like thunder rolling away into distance. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the bench until her knuckles whitened, and her heart drummed a beat too fast for her age. She had lived a quiet life, one where the biggest surprise in a week might have been the neighbor's cow wandering into her garden. Now, in the span of minutes, two strangers had come and gone, leaving behind a jagged crack in the fragile peace she'd built around herself. Cole knelt a few yards away, methodically collecting the shredded paper from the ground. His hands moved with the same efficiency as before, but Anna could see the difference. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw clenched tight, and his eyes, those watchful, storm-dark eyes, never stopped scanning the horizon. He wasn't just picking up scraps. He was waiting. Finally, Anna forced her legs to move, crossing the short distance between them. She crouched beside him, her joints protesting, and helped gather the remnants of the old targets. For a few moments they worked in silence, the air heavy with everything unsaid. Then she spoke, her voice steady but low. "You're going to have to tell me us." Paper into the burlap sack, his movements sharp, as if each tier of paper was an outlet for something far more violent. "It's nothing you need to worry about." Anna bristled. "Don't insult me, Cole. Two men show up out of nowhere, calling you out like a stray dog, and I'm not supposed to worry?" She tossed another strip of paper into the sack, her voice hardening. "If you think you can just walk into my life, stir up God knows what kind of danger, and leave me in the dark, you're wrong." That got his attention. Cole stopped, his hand frozen mid-motion. Slowly he turned his head toward her. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she almost regretted pushing. There was a fire in his gaze, not anger directed at her, but the kind of heat that came from years of battles, betrayals, and blood. Still she held his stare. She had lived through grief, through loneliness, through the hollow silence of nights when she thought she never now. Finally, Cole exhaled sharply, as though surrendering a battle he hadn't wanted to fight. He dropped the last scraps into the bag and straightened, towering over her. "They're not strangers," he said at last. His voice was low, controlled, but there was something dangerous thrumming beneath the surface. "They're from a past I've been trying to bury." Anna stood as well, brushing dirt from her hands. What kind of past? He hesitated, his jaw tightening, then finally looked away. The kind that doesn't stay buried. Anna waited, letting the silence press on him. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to draw truth from someone was simply to give them space to let it out. And after a long pause, Cole spoke again. I was a SEAL, he said, the words clipped, almost reluctant. Special operations. We went places we weren't supposed to be. Did things no one's supposed to know. Most of the time it was clean. Missions in, missions out. But sometimes, he trailed off, his throat working as though the next words were shards of glass. Sometimes it wasn't clean. Anna felt her chest tighten. She guessed as much, that he was military, that he carried battles in his eyes, but hearing him say it made the weight of it settle deeper. Those men, Cole continued, they weren't enemies in the way you think. Not terrorists. Not foreign soldiers. They were contractors. Private. We worked with them on more than one op. They don't forget faces. And they don't forgive debts. Anna's breath caught. Debts. Cole's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and almost warning. But then, perhaps realizing there was no turning back now, he nodded. We took something from them. Not money. Information. Files on their operations. Proof of what they were doing outside the law. We handed it over to command. Thought it was finished. But men like that, they don't forgive and they don't stop. They've been following me ever since I left the teams. Anna felt the ground shift beneath her, not physically but inside her. This quiet man who had helped her staple paper targets and shared her morning coffee, was now painted in shadows of espionage, betrayal, and blood. And by standing beside him she realized she might already be marked. She steadied herself with a deep breath. So what happens now? Cole looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw hesitation. Not fear, he was not the kind of man who feared for himself. But something close. Concern. He studied her face as if weighing whether to tell her the truth. Now, he said finally, you need to stay out of it. Anna let out a humorless laugh. Stay out of it? Cole, they already saw me. They already know I exist. You think they're just going to forget? He didn't answer, but his silence said everything. Anna crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. You're not leaving me in the dark, and you're not leaving me here defenseless. Samuel taught me enough to know when a fight's already come to your doorstep. And it looks like this one has. Cole studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he gave a small nod. All right, he said. But you have to understand, once you're in this, there's no going back to the way things were. Anna met his gaze without flinching. I haven't gone back since the day Samuel died. This might be the first time I felt alive again. The honesty of her words hung in the air, surprising even her. Cole's expression softened almost imperceptibly, the hardness in his eyes flickering into something else. Respect, maybe even admiration. He reached for his rifle, holding it not as a weapon this time but as a symbol. Then if you're in, he said quietly, you need to learn. Learn what? He stepped closer, pressing the rifle into her hands again. How to carry this. How to use it. Because if they come back, and they will, you won't have the luxury of staying on the sidelines. Her fingers closed around the weapon, the weight familiar now, though no less daunting. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign that this was madness. But what she saw instead was conviction, the kind of conviction that only came from someone who had walked through fire and survived. And so, standing there on the quiet shooting range with the morning sun spilling across the valley, Anna Blake, widow, caretaker, ordinary woman, took her first lesson from a Navy SEAL. The next morning came quietly, the sun filtering across the training ground in thin golden lines, the dew still clinging to the earth as if reluctant to leave. The woman had barely slept. Her mind was alive with the events of the night before, the weight of the rifle he had placed into her chest when his eyes had met hers and lingered there longer than they should have. She was not a soldier. She reminded herself of that over and over, yet the pounding of her heart whenever she thought of his trust was undeniable. To hold a SEAL's rifle, to have it pressed into her palms as if it belonged there, it was something she had never imagined her life would bring. She rose before dawn, dressed simply, and made her way toward the range, driven by some pull she could not quite explain. She wanted to be there before him, as if to prove that she had not taken lightly the silent bond formed between them. When she arrived, the grounds were empty, save for the faint smoke curling up from the remnants of a fire lit the night before. She walked slowly, the silence thick around her, until she reached the stand where the targets had been laid out. The wooden posts still bore the scars of countless bullets. She ran her fingers across them, feeling the grooves, the splinters where the shots had torn through. She saw his discipline, his control, his strength. Every hole was not just a puncture but a story of focus, of intent, of survival. She knelt there, staring at them as if trying to understand the language written in gunfire, when she heard the crunch of boots behind her. She turned, and there he was, carrying his gear with that quiet steadiness that never seemed to falter. His eyes found her instantly, and he stopped in his stride, his expression unreadable. "You're early," he said after a moment, setting his pack down. She smiled faintly. "I wanted to be here before you." "Why?" The question caught her off guard. She looked down at the ground, then back up at him. "Because last night you gave me something no one else would. I don't know why you did it, but I didn't want you to think I'd treat it carelessly. I came because it matters to me." He studied her, his gaze as piercing as always, though softer somehow. "Good," he said, his voice low but certain. "Because I don't hand that rifle to just anyone." The air between them thickened with unspoken truths, with the understanding that something had shifted. She didn't know if she was ready for it, but she knew she couldn't step back now. He set up his equipment methodically, his hands steady, his movements precise. She watched, learning without asking, absorbing the way he handled each piece as if every motion was part of a ritual. When he finally lifted his rifle and checked it over, she felt again the echo of its weight in her own hands from the night before. She wondered if he thought of that too, or if she was the only one carrying it in her chest like a secret flame. Hours passed as he trained, and she resumed her quiet task of replacing the targets when needed, her steps sure, her hands steady. Yet something had changed. Each time she walked down the line to set a new board, she felt his eyes following her, not out of suspicion but something different, something she couldn't name. When their gazes met across the distance, her breath would falter, her pulse quicken. He never spoke much, yet in his silence, there was a gravity that drew her closer. It was as if words would have been too fragile to contain what passed between them. At one point he paused in his training, lowering his weapon and walking toward her. She stood still, watching him approach, her hands nervously clasped in front of her. He stopped just a foot away, the shadow of his figure stretching over her. "You handled it well," he said, his tone almost grudging but sincere. She blinked. "Handled what?" "The rifle. Last night. Most people freeze when they hold something like that. It's more than just metal. It carries responsibility, weight. You didn't freeze. You respected it." Her chest tightened and she swallowed hard. "It wasn't the rifle I was thinking about." "Was you?" "The fact that you trusted me with it." His eyes softened again, a flicker of something raw passing through them before he masked it. "Trust doesn't come easy for me," he admitted, almost as if speaking to himself. "But you've earned it." Those words landed in her like an anchor, grounding her even as they threatened to pull her under. She wanted to ask him why, what he saw in her, why someone like him, a soldier hardened by battles she could never imagine, would see worth in a simple woman who replaced targets. But she couldn't bring herself to ask, not when the silence between them felt so fragile, so sacred. Instead, she nodded and he turned back to his work, though she noticed the way his shoulders had eased, the way his movements carried a touch less of the weight he always bore. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, they found themselves sitting near the fire once again. The rifle lay between them, untouched for now, as if the crackle of the wood filling the quiet, and finally spoke. "You must have seen so much," she said softly. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet, distant. "Too much. More than I care to remember. But some things you can't leave behind no matter how far you go." She turned her gaze toward him, seeing the shadows etched across his face. "Does it ever get easier?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "No. You just learn to carry it better." Her heart ached at the weight in his words. She wanted to reach across the fire, to touch his hand, to give him something he couldn't find in battle or training, a piece of peace however small. But she stayed still, sensing that such a gesture might break him open in ways he wasn't ready for. Instead she said, "Then let me carry some of it with you. If only a little. You don't have to do it all alone." His head turned, trying to find any hint of insincerity. Whatever he saw seemed to disarm him because he exhaled slowly, the tension in his jaw easing. "You don't know what you're offering," he murmured. "Maybe not," she admitted, her voice steady. "But I know what it means to stand beside someone when they need it. And right now I think you need it." For a long time he said nothing. The fire crackled, the night deepened, and the silence stretched. Then, without a word, he reached for the rifle, lifted it gently, and placed it once again into her hands. She held it, the weight both familiar and overwhelming, her breath catching in her throat. His eyes stayed on her, unwavering, and in that moment, it was not just about trust or training or even the weapon itself. It was about connection, about something neither of them had asked for but had found all the same. As the night wrapped around them, she realized that the rifle was no longer just a symbol of his world. It had become between theirs. And she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that she would never see herself as simple again. Not after him. Not after this. The days began to blur together for Anna, though each one carried its own weight, its own test, and its own quiet victories. She found herself in the strange position of being trusted in ways she had never imagined. Only a week ago, she had been just a volunteer at the range, sweeping brass, replacing paper targets, and handing out ear protection to newcomers who came to watch the soldiers train. Now she was walking among men whose very posture carried the weight of battle, who had scars etched into their arms and faces like maps of pain and survival, and they treated her not as a distraction, not even just as a helper, but as someone who belonged in their circle. That shift was something she could feel in every glance, every nod, every unspoken acknowledgement. It was both empowering and terrifying. The rifle entrusted to her by Cole had become more than just a weapon, it was a symbol. Every time she picked it up, she felt the gravity of what it meant. It wasn't simply about the steel and mechanics, nor about hitting a paper target in the distance. It was about the trust of a man who had seen war, who had carried that rifle through sand and blood and fire, who had used it not only to fight but to protect the lives of the brothers beside him. To hand it over to her was something far more profound than she could explain, and she carried that responsibility with the seriousness of someone who refused to disappoint. Each evening after the drills, the men often relaxed by the fire pit behind the range. They would talk quietly, their words stitched together with half-smiles, sometimes laughter, sometimes silence. Anna listened more than she spoke, learning about them in fragments, stories of childhood, of first deployments, of losses that slipped into the conversation like ghosts. One night, a SEAL named Ramirez lost in an ambush years ago. Another, a broad-shouldered man called Dane, mentioned how he still wrote letters to his daughter every week even though he had no idea if she ever received them while he was away. Cole himself rarely spoke of the past, but his eyes, sharp and steady during the day, sometimes softened when the firelight caught them just right, as though the flames pulled memories from him he'd rather keep buried. Anna, without realizing it, became part of this quiet circle of vulnerability. She didn't need to impress them with grand speeches or prove herself through some extraordinary act of courage. She was simply present. She listened. She cared. And slowly, the men who had lived through unspeakable things began to relax around her, as though her presence reminded them of something normal, something steady, something human in the midst of all their relentless training. But with this acceptance came the test. The SEALs never outright declared them, but after a long session of replacing torn targets, Ramirez handed her a pistol without saying a word. He watched as she fumbled with the weight, but then guided her hand, showed her the safety, explained the stance. She listened carefully, mimicking his posture, correcting her grip until his nod of approval told her she had it right. Later, Dane tossed her a pack and asked her to carry it during a jog around the training field. It was heavier than she expected, stuffed with gear that nearly bent her knees. Still, she said nothing, forcing herself to keep pace until her lungs burned and her legs screamed. When she stumbled across the finish, drenched in sweat, Dane's grin and clap on her shoulder told her more than words ever could. She had passed. Cole, however, tested her in ways that were quieter, subtler. He didn't push her with weights or drills. Instead, he asked her questions. Questions about focus, about responsibility, about what she did to carry something that wasn't hers but could mean the difference between life and death. "When you hold that rifle," he asked one evening while they stood alone at the edge of the field, "do you think about yourself? Or about the man who'll stand beside you?" She hesitated, unsure, but then answered honestly, "I think about the weight of it, that it matters more than me." His faint smile told her that was the answer he had been waiting for. What Anna didn't realize was that the trust placed in her had rippled outward beyond the circle of the men. Visitors to the range, instructors from neighboring units, even officers who oversaw the training began to notice her presence. At first, they saw her as an oddity, a civilian woman walking among elite soldiers, carrying a rifle that wasn't hers. But soon they noticed the way the men treated her, the way they respected her silence, the way they nodded when she passed. That respect was earned, not given, and that reality began to shift how other women either. One afternoon, when the sun beat down hard against the field and the air shimmered with heat, Cole called her to the firing line. The men had just finished their drills, and sweat dripped from their brows as they collapsed onto benches, pulling off their vests and helmets. Cole, however, stood waiting with the rifle in his hands. He held it out to her in front of everyone. "Anna," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet, "today you take the shot." She froze, her heart slamming in her chest. All eyes turned to her. She had fired before, under Cole's careful instruction, but always in private, always when no one else was watching. Now every man at the range, their hardened faces, their trained eyes, was waiting to see what she would do. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the weapon, the weight both familiar and crushing. She walked to the line, feeling the earth beneath her boots, the sky pressing down from above, the silence wrapping around her like a test. Cole's voice came low and steady behind her. "Breathe. Remember your stance. Trust the rifle. Trust yourself." She inhaled slowly, lined up the sights, focused on the target 50 meters away. The world narrowed into a tunnel. The target, the crosshairs, her finger against the trigger. She exhaled, squeezed gently, and the rifle thundered. The bullet ripped through the air and punched the paper dead center. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then, as the target swayed from the impact, the men erupted into cheers. Ramirez whistled. Dane clapped his hands together. Someone shouted, "Bullseye!" Anna lowered the rifle, her arms shaking not from recoil but from the flood of adrenaline coursing through her. She turned and Cole's eyes locked with hers. There was no need for words, the pride in his expression said everything. She was someone worthy of the trust they had given her. That night, as the fire crackled and the men spoke quietly among themselves, Anna sat with the rifle across her lap, tracing the lines of the weapon with her fingertips. She knew her life would never be the same. She wasn't just replacing targets anymore.